In recent months, the coronavirus has ripped through the world, causing havoc in its wake.
Breaking news to bring you concerning the numbers of COVID-19 cases in the United Kingdom.
You heard the president say, look, stay home. It's bad. These are the president's words. It's bad, he said.
708 Australians have tested positive to COVID-19. This is the national breakdown.
Despite its usual immunity to these things, the world of football has proved to be just as susceptible to the virus.
I tell you, I've just received a statement from the EFL. They've just come out and given me it, and all games will be suspended and postponed from this weekend. Let me just read.
I think if something shows out in a moment that there are some things that are more important than football, then I think we realise that in this moment.
The Norwegian FA have just confirmed that the European Championships this summer will be postponed until 2021.
With almost no professional football being played for the near future, new questions are being raised about the state of the game.
The other situation, of course, for the likes of yourself and Ryan Fraser and a few others at Bournemouth, is the contract situation, because your contract currently ends at the end of June.
Not a lot's been said, but if the season goes through June, July, then obviously a short-term contract might have to be signed with a view to a long-term one.
In this episode, we ask, what impact has coronavirus had upon the business side of football? And can things ever be the same again?
First and foremost, we have done what everyone else has been doing, and that's coronavirus reporting, right?
Manuel Veth is area manager of the USA for TransferMarkt and covers the Bundesliga for Forbes.
This is something that's impacted every single person, and it's impacted the player market just like everything else. So, we run basically the news that which leagues are suspended and which clubs have suspended, and we also have like a running order on players that get the virus. At the same time, I think this is kind of like an off-season, so the transfer market has heated up in some ways. So I think our job hasn't changed that much. I think just the stories have changed a little bit, if that makes sense.
There's so many consequences on the financial side of football, it seems hard to know even where to begin. But let's start with the macro level question. So this pandemic is intrinsically connected to the economy. We know that football has become financialised in recent decades, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what knock-ons the current economic crisis will have on football clubs.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem for football clubs is that they very much live in the now. The money that they receive is earmarked to spend. Very few clubs around the world are financially viable. One big markets that I cover is, of course, the Bundesliga, the Premier League, and Major League Soccer, as you know, right? Those are the three big markets that I cover on TransferMarkt. And Bundesliga clubs are probably the most prepared for it because they have to be financially viable, because they know the money that they earn, that goes to themselves. It's not going to an owner. In other markets, it's a bit more tricky. In England, for example, in the Premier League, the money that they earn is earmarked for spending. In the Championship, the division below, clubs spend about 116% of the money that they earn. So that money is earmarked, right? So money that they're losing right now is going to hurt them significantly. What the exact impact of this is going to be is very, very, very difficult to tell. But I can tell you that if this season doesn't get finished and there's no more football, let's say for 5 or 6 months, a lot of clubs will struggle, and we might even see some bankruptcies.
What sort of impact do you think the clubs are going to face from the fact that the season has stopped right in the middle of proceedings? As you've said, a lot of these clubs are primed to operate on the cusp of sustainability. Is there a lot of clubs that won't survive the immediate cash flow issue? Is there a sort of time limit that they can operate for before they'll, as you said, go bankrupt?
That's another one that's really difficult to say. I think that clubs can survive maybe 1 or 2 months without games. I mean, it really also depends on the league. Some leagues are more dependent on attendance numbers than others. Give you an example again, Major League Soccer, they can't survive without people in the stadium. That's why, playing behind closed door is not an option. Whereas the Premier League or the Bundesliga, they can play behind closed door and they would still get the television money, right? So that would allow them to survive, but it would still mean they would lose money, which still would have a big impact on the overall football economy.
One of the questions that I've wondered about actually is that obviously clubs have to plan for a summer break and they have to be sustainable through that summer break. Is there many clubs just forecasting this as being the summer break and then hoping that they can balance the books on the basis of that?
I think that's an intriguing question, and I think that's probably maybe the hope that some of these clubs have. okay, well, maybe this is our summer break. Premier League is a great example for this. They just extended the season indefinitely, right? We don't know when we're going to be able to play again. Let's say the season finishes in September. I think that the break between the end of this season, whenever this season ends, and the start to the next season is going to be very short. This could very well be the off-season, right? Which would allow clubs to financially survive in some ways, because it would basically mean the break that everyone would happen now anyways. And I think that's also why the Premier League and other leagues will do the same. They will all extend the season indefinitely because they cannot lose out on that television money. And if the season gets annulled or gets stopped, they will lose out on that television money. And that would mean bankruptcies, right? So I think that is pretty much what they're kind of trying to do. They're basically saying, okay, well, I guess this is our off-season now. And they're going to treat it like this is our off-season. And that's sort of maybe going to help clubs to be sustainable through this very difficult period.
Of course, clubs are as much businesses in themselves as entertainment ventures these days. You wrote a piece in TransferMarkt recently that suggested that Borussia Dortmund have seen their stocks tumble in value by around 45% since the coronavirus appeared. What sort of effect do you think the coronavirus's impact on the economy is going to have on elite clubs?
Borussia Dortmund is a great example because, yes, they lost 45% of the stock value, which means that they had a win warning come out, that they had to pull back, that they're not expected to run a profit this year. This would have been, I think, the 5th or 6th time in a row that the club would have run a profit, which is, in football terms, is fantastic numbers, right? There's not many clubs out there that can say something like that. I think Bayern and Dortmund, actually, of the top clubs, are one of the only ones that can manage that on a regular basis. So they've basically pulled that back. Now, for Dortmund, that's not going to be a problem. They have so much money stockpiled for a scenario like that they're going to be able to survive. They will just have to dig into their savings. That means, of course, that maybe some of the things that they have planned for the off-season will be put on the back burner a little bit for, let's say, maybe a year. And that's going to impact, I think, the economy the most. Clubs are basically saying, okay, well, we have investments planned, but maybe those investments we're going to have to put on hold because of income that we are planning on is all of a sudden gone.
On January the 31st, the transfer window will close.
Join Jim, me and the whole team for all the transfer deadline day news on Sky Sports News HQ.
I think the question on everyone's mind is going to be, how's this going to affect the summer transfer market? Do you think there'll even be one? Will clubs be unhappy committing for player sales at all? What should we expect from this downtime, as you've called it, this off-season now, in terms of transfer activity?
Clubs can't help themselves. There will be transfers. I've actually heard from several sources that clubs are basically using this time to plan, to work on transfers that they maybe would have normally worked on in May. They're working on now, right? And I think that there will be transfers. Now, the transfer market will look different, I think. I think there is less money to be spent. It will be a more cautious market in the past. And some of the big transfers that we were maybe hoping to see, like Jadon Sancho, Kai Havertz, Upamecano, to look at some of the players that I've been looking at, we might not see those transfers this summer. They just might not happen, because clubs will say, like, look, we're not going to get what we want for a certain player this summer because clubs just don't have the spending power. So let's just hang on to the asset. And you will maybe see players extend their contracts with this in mind as well. Players will move. There will be transfers. Players will sign for other clubs simply because clubs cannot help themselves. Players cannot help themselves. But I think this could be a summer transfer window that's not dictated by the big name moves.
It's interesting that you've mentioned Jadon Sancho there, for example. There's obviously another angle here, which is the players themselves are going to be impacted by this. So how do you think players, like you said, Jadon Sancho, a young phenom, how's he going to respond to this upheaval in the markets? Do you think it will end up having a long-term impact on his career?
Well, it all depends on how long it takes, right? How long will this break take? We don't know what COVID-19 is going to do. We have very little understanding of it, and we have very little understanding on how long this break is going to be. What's going to happen, for example, if players get this virus? Are they going to come back to full fitness? We just don't know. There's so many unknowns in this. We can maybe look back at like some other sports where there's been lockdowns. NHL, for example, the National Hockey League in Canada and the United States has locked out its players over labor disputes and cancelled entire seasons. The market values of players didn't really change because of, they missed a year, but because of the changing dynamics of the economy. So I think that's really what we need to look out for. We need to look out for what's the economic impact rather than what is the impact on the individual players.
Do you think this is going to make the market more efficient? I'm thinking particularly of players at the end of their careers. Do you think we'll start seeing players retiring early, or players losing places at clubs because of age uncertainty and the fact that clubs have to be careful with their money?
Well, it all depends. I mean, if players are under contract, clubs can't just walk away from contracts. We've seen now a case in Switzerland, in Sion, where FC Sion has basically fired the entire squad, right? Whether they will get away with this legally is a very big question mark. I doubt it. I think that it's going to be very hard for clubs to sever existing contracts. Players that are on the cusp of their career, you know, if they're going to retire this summer, maybe they're not going to come back when the season comes back. There's a chance of that, right? But in the end of the day, contracts are contracts. And that is maybe perhaps the bigger question. What is going to happen with contracts that are going to expire on June 30th, but the season runs, let's say, to October? We simply don't have an answer to that yet either.
The football calendar obviously is rigidly cyclical, and so the fact that everyone's player contract pretty much ends on June the 30th is going to be impacted here. If the current season is rearranged at a later date, then presumably a lot of players are going to be moved past their expiry dates and will lead to problems even for players still in contract for a long time, yet if the seasons have a long-term knock-on effect. So how do you think clubs are going to respond to this changing in the football calendar?
Well, they will have to talk to their players. My colleague Daniel Busch from TransferMarkt, as we speak, ran a piece on Willian saying he's one of the players. And I did this piece yesterday, right, that his contract is expiring June 30th. That if the season is extended, he will stay at Chelsea and finish the season. Now, contractually, he doesn't have to. It's voluntary. And that's basically what clubs will have to talk to their players and say, look, I know your contract is up June 30th, but we're playing till September 30th. That's not a firm date. I'm just throwing that out there, right? Could you stay on until the season ends and then go into free agency then? Players don't have to do this. Clubs don't have to do it either. They could also say, okay, well, it's June 30th, your contract is up. We don't need you to finish the season. Bye-bye. That's a reality of things. Now, FIFA could say, okay, well, we're going to make it illegal for players to move during that time period. Essentially move the transfer window back, right? That means players cannot be registered at new clubs, but it doesn't actually change the fact that the contracts are still up. So I think this will be basically a player-to-player, club-to-club kind of discussion. Players and clubs will basically have to sit down and discuss the situation and discuss this case by case. And that's going to make it for some very interesting scenarios, I think, once we get past that June 30th deadline.
So do you think we'll see many of the players playing hardball with their clubs when they're trying to extend their contracts in the short term?
I would like to think no. I hope that this extraordinary times means that everyone is in this together. Literally an entire planet is in this together. We all have to deal with a certain amount of uncertainty. We all have to deal with things that were unexpected to us, different work environments. So I expect that any decent human being is willing to change just a little bit to accommodate this extraordinary time. Does that mean that everyone will comply? I don't know. It's not a question I can really answer. But I think, we've seen it time and time again. Some people might.
What about the free agent market? Because obviously that's going to be expanded as players fall out of contract. Do you think there's going to be a surprising upheaval in squad turnovers and players going elsewhere to sort of cover gaps in squads?
Possibly. I think the free agent market is going to be pretty much the same as always. I mean, it also will depend what will happen to clubs, like what happens if certain clubs go bankrupt. Those players will all of a sudden be free agents, right? Which then, of course, will lead to a massive deflation of the overall transfer market. The price bubble could very well burst if talent is all of a sudden available to a much larger extent. So this is another one where we're saying, like, we just found out that the season is being extended indefinitely. We don't know when we're going to come back and what kind of health the clubs are going to be in when the football gets underway again, right? And what players are going to be available and what players are not going to be available. It's another one where we're saying, okay, this is an enormous amount of uncertainty.
Have you got much of a sense from how the players themselves are responding to the possibilities thrown up by coronavirus in terms of their employment? Is there much chatter going on around the news sources?
Yeah, there is quite a bit. You see a lot of players show quite a bit of solidarity. I think that's the positive. The German national team, for example, donated 2.5 million euros towards the fight against COVID-19, right? At Gladbach, a bunch of players decided that they're going to forfeit their salary You read cases like that throughout the football world. The toilet paper roll challenge that you see on Twitter, for example, all the players are participating. I think for now you still have a very good sense of solidarity with the players, the clubs, knowing that this is special times. So I think the players are trying to stay as positive as they can and, wait and see approach. I think that's really what you see from a lot of the players at this moment.
What do you think about the unintended consequences of this fallout? Do you think we'll see players refusing to play, clubs having to resort to using youth players, for example?
It will depend on what the situation is like when we come back. Christian Seifert, the CEO of the Bundesliga, said, look, at some point we'll have to start playing. We will have to start playing, otherwise we're going to go bankrupt. And that might include what they call in German Geisterspiele, ghost games, right? Games behind closed doors. That could throw up an entire array of questions and that what happens if certain players don't feel safe? And what happens if we have all of a sudden, 2 months to finish 10 games? That's a lot of games, just league games and Champions League, etc., etc. The turnover, the squad will be enormous. There will be a lot of more players playing and there will be some very random results. And I don't think players are necessarily going to refuse, but I think we're going to see a massive turnover in the amount of players used by different squads. Because when we come back, there will be a lot of games played in a very short period. That's going to probably be the most fascinating aspect of it.
I want to move on to talk about the longer term impacts of coronavirus then. I think one of the biggest impacts of the virus has been the way that's ripped up traditional ideas about economics generally and sent a lot of economists back to the drawing board. How do you think football is going to respond to this process? Will things have to change? Can football continue to be so hyper-financialised in a world which is softly losing that edge?
Short answer, no. They have to change. Absolutely have to change. I think that's very interesting. Again, Christian Seifert gave an interesting talk about that last August. For the most part, the German first and second division clubs are very financially viable. They don't spend 100% of their income, and which is why I think they will do better in this crisis than most clubs around the world. Again, in the Championship in England, the average spending of the income is 116%. That's not viable. In the Premier League, it's very much the same. Clubs spend 100% of what they earn. That's not viable. That needs to change. And I think that's going to be something that's going to impact the market overall. I think football's always thought that no matter what happens, no matter what crisis, football will always be played. Then the pandemic comes around the corner and all of a sudden, we have the first time in the history that football has to be cancelled. That's a scenario that they never had to deal with before. Right? All of a sudden, income that you always thought is going to be there, no matter what the economic surroundings is going to be, is gone. And I think clubs will have to adjust to it accordingly. And I think that is going to change the market dramatically. I think that clubs will look into being more financially viable. And that will mean you will see spending is going to come down.
If you're in a scenario where your assets are players who are worth value simply because they play, when the possibility of no play comes in, your assets are suddenly worth nothing. And so you're in this business where essentially if everyone stops playing, everything that you have is worth nothing anyway. And so it's a hugely risky business to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You're basically living day to day.
In the UK, we've already seen the National League come out today. That's the 68 teams in the 3 leagues below the Football League, suggesting that they're in need of a £17 million bailout package to survive the virus. Which clubs do you think are in a worse state? Is it the clubs at the top or the clubs at the bottom?
Definitely at the bottom. The big clubs are going to be fine. They're not going to be the same and they're going to lose money, but ultimately their brands are so powerful, it doesn't matter too much to them. Right? They might have to live with spending a little less. But the small clubs, some of them could go away forever. And I'm not saying that lightly. This is very much true. Clubs can go and disappear. I think when you look at the smaller end of the scale, this could do it. I mean, there is certain clubs around the world that are already on the brink of going bankrupt anyways, right? And this could very much push them over the edge and they might just be gone. That would be sad, of course, but that's also an economic reality. We never really seen clubs disappear indefinitely, but this could do it.
What do you think the long-term impacts are going to be in terms of football's labour law? We've obviously talked about contracts a lot, but are we going to start seeing contracts changing, taking into account the possibility of things like pandemic viruses in the future?
Oh man, I don't think we can. I think it's not possible. Could you imagine, if you try to get an insurance against a pandemic? I mean, it was already expensive beforehand, but now that it's actually a real thing, it's going to be next to impossible. some things you just can't plan for. You know, this is a massive natural catastrophe. It's not something that we can insure ourselves against it. I mean, this is no different than an earthquake or a volcano eruption or a meteor hitting us, right? It's just not something that you can really plan for. You just hope it doesn't happen and you move on with your normal life. So I think in this regard, once, we start playing again, we're going to go back to what we had before. Maybe the schedule will be different and we'll have to adjust our contracts to that. But I don't think we're going to see massive changes in labor law because of this.
So, do you think we'll see football being played in a year's time, and what do you think it will look like?
I really hope so. This is day 2 of my shutdown here on Vancouver Island, and the prospect of this lasting another 6 weeks is dooming for me. The prospect of this maybe lasting months, which is possible when you listen to the experts that talk about this outbreak. We could be in this for months, and we could be in this and everything could go back to normal, and the next spring hits and this thing comes back. The uncertainty of this is incredible. What it will do to our game is very hard to say. Maybe it will reshuffle the board a little bit, and maybe make football a little bit more competitive in the medium term or long term even. I'm not saying, yay or hooray, we have a pandemic, let's level the playing field, but it could do that. I think it also will give football a chance to maybe just to rethink its model a little bit. The world that we currently live is going to be a different one when we're walking out of this pandemic. And I think we will walk into a different landscape, and the different landscape will also mean that the football that we've known before the pandemic will be a different one afterwards.
If you want to read Manuel Veth's coverage of football, you can read him at TransferMarkt and Forbes. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler and Hugo Chambray. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe or rate on iTunes or share an episode with a friend? Thanks for listening.